Good evening, everyone. I'm Mark Nordenberg, the former chancellor of the University of Pittsburgh. I currently serve as chair of Pitt's Institute of Politics and director of its Dick Thornberg Forum for Law and Public Policy. It is my privilege to welcome you to this very special American Experience Distinguished Speaker program. On behalf of the Thornberg Forum, the University Honors College, the Institute of Politics, and an impressive list of co-sponsors, including the Center for International Legal Education, which just this week had an alum named President of Kosovo, the Departments of History and Political Science, the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs, the University Center for International Studies, and the World Affairs Council of Pittsburgh. On February 4th, just 2 weeks after his inauguration, President Biden visited the State Department. The heart of the president's message, the message that he explicitly said he wanted the world to hear that afternoon, was this: America is back. America is back. Diplomacy is back at the center of our foreign policy. Simply by having lived through the preceding administration, most of us had at least a rough sense of what our current president meant. But this evening, we'll have the chance to deepen our understandings through a discussion with Ambassador Robert B. Zoellick, whose recently released book, America in the World, A History of U.S. Diplomacy and Foreign Policy, has been described as so sweeping and insightful that it will revive the art of diplomatic history. Before introducing Ambassador Zoellick to you, though, let me respectfully note last week's passing of Dr. Larry Davis. Larry was the former dean of our School of Social Work, the founding director of our Center on Race and Social Problems, and the first faculty member to hold the Donald N. Henderson Chair. He was a distinguished scholar, an accomplished leader, and a good friend to many of us. He was the first person in history to be awarded Lifetime Achievement Awards by both the major social work organization focused on social work research and the major professional organization focused on social work education. Last year, as we prepared to mark the 50th anniversary of the American Experience program, I asked Larry if he would be our golden anniversary speaker. In September, he delivered a lecture that asked, "Will race always matter?" It was both thoughtful and thought-provoking, though we could not have known it at the time. It also would prove to be Larry's last lecture. It is available online. We miss him. But we're proud to be a part of his legacy. Our very special guest tonight is Robert Zoellick, though we have not been in close proximity to each other through our adult lives. Our friendship almost qualifies as historic in the sense that it dates back more than 50 years. To a time when he was a teenager moving through junior high and high school in the western suburbs of Chicago, and was a very close friend to my younger brother, John. I was in college and law school at the time, but I visited my parents on vacations and stayed with them during the summer while I worked on road construction. So I had the chance to get to know Bob. Some of my earliest recollections involve basketball games in my parents' driveway. Anyone passing would have quickly concluded that none of us had a future in the NBA. Fortunately, it appears that Bob, who was declared to be both an excellent student and a very good person by the highest of authorities, my mother, appears to have had other alternatives. So let me quickly list some of the many things that he has done in his extraordinary non-basketball career. He has served as the president of the World Bank, assuming that office at a time of internal turmoil and just before the global financial crisis hit, as ambassador and U.S. trade representative, as deputy secretary and undersecretary of state, as counselor to the secretaries of state and treasury, and as White House deputy chief of staff. Among many special forms of recognition, he has received the Distinguished Service Award from the State Department, its highest honor, the Alexander Hamilton Award from the Department of the Treasury, and the Medal for Distinguished Public Service from the Department of Defense. His current academic home is the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs in the Kennedy School at Harvard, where he is a senior fellow. There also is an extended family connection to Pitt that I need to mention. Bob's late father-in-law, Glenn Ferguson, crafted his own very impressive career. Just to list some of the positions he held, he was U.S. ambassador to Kenya, the president of Radio Free Europe, the president of Clark University, the University of Connecticut, and the American University of Paris. And he was the first director of VISTA, Volunteers in Service to America. We can proudly say that he built at least some part of the foundation for that impactful life at Pitt. He not only earned his law degree here, but was a professor of international studies, worked in the office of then Chancellor Litchfield, and was a part of the leadership team that actually founded our Graduate School of Public and International Affairs. To make these links even tighter, he graduated from Pitt Law School in the same class as Dick Thornberg. So here is his son-in-law speaking at a program co-sponsored by the forum that bears the name of his law school classmate. And if that is not enough, Dick served as Attorney General for a period that spanned the administrations of Presidents Reagan and the first President Bush, and Bob served in both of those administrations. So let me ask you first, Bob, do you have any impressions of Governor/Attorney General Thornberg that you would care to share?
Well, first, Mark, let me thank you for that very generous introduction. And I hope the audience notes that I was the friend of Mark's younger brother. And of course, all of you, of course, know Chancellor Nordenberg in his august stage. For a modest, perhaps, opportunity or drink or beer or something, I can offer you some insights on Mark Nordenberg's earlier years, but I'll leave that for another occasion. It's a wonderful privilege to be with the Pitt community and with Mark. And of course, it's a special distinction to take part in an event recognizing the late Governor and Attorney General Richard Thornberg. Now, this Pitt audience, of course, knows Dick Thornberg well. Thornberg as in Pittsburgh, I believe it was said in an early campaign ad. And his sterling record, whether in dealing with the crisis in 3 Mile Island or the prosecution of organized crime and corruption, strengthening the state's economy, education, early leader on environmental issues. But this evening, I'd like to mention two other legacies, less well known, but that may offer another measure of the man. One of Attorney General Thornberg's greatest accomplishments was the passage of the Americans for Disabilities Act, a landmark civil rights law. Now, President George H.W. Bush is known in history primarily for his role in foreign policy, but he also had some striking accomplishments at home: the Clean Air Act amendments, a brave budget accord, and the ADA. For Dick Thornberg, equal treatment and opportunity for the disabled was about basic fairness, respect for every person, and recognizing the potential of every American. And one connection I want to share with you is that was a legacy I recalled when I became president of the World Bank some 16 years later. And I started to press for special attention to the role of disabled in the work of development. So I wanted to leave you with the point that true leaders like President Bush and Dick Thornberg plant seeds that grow. But the second legacy may seem very distinct in a perhaps a more modest way, but I think it's telling in a special way about Dick Thornberg. When I was in law school, and I was also studying public policy in the late 1970s, I had a professor, Phil Hyman, who was appointed head of the criminal division in the U.S. Justice Department. And Phil Hyman asked a colleague, Dick Darman, who had served with Elliot Richardson in 5 cabinet posts and was seen as a real wizard at understanding the government, to take a look at the organization and management of the criminal division. And I took a 6-month leave to assist Phil Hyman and Dick Darman. Now, of course, we began by looking at the files. And the memos of one person stood out. Assistant Attorney Dick Thornberg, who had headed the criminal division from 1975 to 77 after the traumas of the Watergate era. And I recall Darman observing that Thornberg was a superb executive, as well as an accomplished prosecutor and lawyer, that he had a clear analytical mind that could cut through old thinking. And his memos were the best that one could have imagined of this. He's a leader who could fix problems, look ahead, but always was seeking to do better. So it's a particular honor to be able to recognize his legacy at Pitt with his home community this evening.
Thank you very much, Bob. And with all of these small world stories, I'm not sure how to make a seamless transition to that big world out there that is not always so friendly and hospitable. So why don't I start with a natural question, and that is, why did you decide to write America in the World?
Well, I guess we introduced the topic by discussing a little bit of history, our own and also that of Dick Thornberg. And when I was in government, I drew upon history as I thought through problems. And one of the reasons I wrote the book was to try to encourage others, particularly those of a next generation, to try to think in these terms. So many people listening tonight are probably familiar with the teaching of foreign policy, which today often relies greatly on international relations theories. And they're intellectually challenging, they're fun to debate, they're professionally interesting, but frankly, I didn't find them of such practical use when I dealt with issues such as German unification or trade strategies or China policy or genocide in Darfur or development with the World Bank. And so what I wanted to do in this book was to focus on practical problem solving. Some of you may know that Henry Kissinger wrote a book in the 90s titled Diplomacy, where he used history to talk about foreign policy. But Kissinger's primary frame of reference was the European realpolitik tradition. So in this book, I wanted to have the stories and the individuals talk about the American experience and ideas. And I suppose one of the other aspects might be of interest, particularly to any students listening, is that because I had an interest in history, I probably used to torture my younger colleagues in those various jobs by asking them what history they knew, because I honestly didn't know. And I discovered that insofar as they had learned history, they had learned from World War II on. Now, Mark Nordenberg and I discussed this a little bit in advance, and he said he never got beyond World War II in his courses, but that gives you a little sense of the generational differences we're talking about here. And the reason I wanted to discuss the period for the first 150 years before World War II is there's some great lessons to be learned and some wonderful figures to try to recall from the mists of time. And I suppose as I've spoken to some universities about the book, one of the parts that's been encouraging for me is a lot of students have found it to be somewhat more optimistic than some of the critical studies thinking that they've been exposed to. Because what I try to show is how history can offer insights on how to do better, not a sense of timeless obstacles, and a realistic assessment that imperfect results from a far from perfect world can also still be a good day.
Well, in terms of stories, your first chapter is titled America's First Diplomat, an honor that is bestowed upon Ben Franklin, who also is regarded as the greatest Pennsylvanian. And you begin with a Franklin story. Would you like to begin with that tonight too?
Sure. So Franklin, of course, is such an extraordinary person in any context to begin with. But what I began with was his period in Paris during the Revolutionary War, when he had two major tasks. One was to negotiate our first alliance with France in 1778, and then, of course, to negotiate the peace in 1783 that ended the Revolutionary War and granted our full independence. And if you think about it, his primary challenge was moving from war to peace. And while that may seem to be a topic of 200 plus years to go, consider how many times we've had to deal with that issue over the past 200 years. It's also an interesting story because Franklin was conducting diplomacy with a weak hand. Now, a couple years ago, I heard former Secretary of Defense Mattis talk about how he was troubled that the United States no longer had total domain dominance in his military terms. And it made me reflect because in much of US history, we had to have total domain dominance, but you still had to conduct your diplomacy. And also, Franklin was in an unusual situation where, in a sense, he had to invent what we now call public diplomacy, because in 1777, 78, the United States was barely known, but Franklin was quite famous. And so he consciously presented himself as a new man from the frontier. People from Philadelphia would have been shocked about this, but he kind of wore homespun clothes. He had sort of a marten fur hat. But of course, he was also a man who was one of the leaders of science in the field and been given various honorary degrees. He became so popular and he appealed to France's sense of style that his image appeared everywhere. So it was on rings and snuff boxes and all sorts of miniature portraits. Louis XVI, the monarch of France, became a little jealous. And for one fan of Franklin, he gave him a chamber pot with Franklin's image on the bottom, just as a way of sort of sending a little message back. Franklin had the challenge that many diplomats had of negotiating with his own delegation. He worked quite well with John Jay. With John Adams, he had a wonderful quote. He said, Adams is always an honest man, often a wise one, and in some things and in some ways, absolutely out of his senses. Anybody who reads about Adams in history will recall that. He had to deal with multiple party negotiations, including with allies. The Congress had directed Franklin and his colleagues not to negotiate with Britain without France's consent, which of course, ultimately they ignore after the Battle of Yorktown because they managed to do a very good deal with Britain. And then at the end of it, Franklin has to do this wonderful apology to the French because he's got to ask for another loan. Another aspect about diplomacy is a sense of timing, when to act, when not to act. And Franklin's story captures this as well. Early in 1777, after a series of defeats, one of Franklin's colleagues, Arthur Lee, said, we have to go tell the French that they need to recognize us now or this may all be over. And Franklin thought, maybe best to wait a little bit. The victory in Saratoga later in the year gave them the leverage. And then because spies were around, he started to reach out to the British because the British were considering maybe some interim deal. And of course, the French snapped at that and gave the formal alliance. He also had a skill that I think is very important in negotiations, and Mark would know this as a lawyer, is that it's important to keep your eye on the primary objective. sometimes in negotiations, there's many topics you can get diverted, but it's important to keep your idea on the real things that you want to get done. He also had a wonderful comment that I felt in all aspects of my life, which is that even small gestures can influence great people and big events. And so he was always attentive to his relations with his people and counterparts. And then there's also an interesting little point about Congress and public opinion. So after they negotiate this fantastic deal, which extends the new United States all the way to the Mississippi River, one of his colleagues, Henry Loren, says, well, I expect, the country will give you a great debt of gratitude, Dr. Franklin. And Franklin's comment was, he said, I've never known a peace that somebody didn't object to in some form or another. So that idea in the Bible of blessed are the peacemakers is probably for the next life, not this one. So in this one short story from 225 years ago, you can find a lot of themes that resonate over the following years.
Well, and I guess taking themes from Franklin's life probably is a good bet in many different things. In addition to that story, at the very beginning of the book, you do articulate 5 traditions in American diplomacy that have been drawn from history. And one of the things that I really liked was not only did you give them at the start, but you came back to them at the end, which was nice. We won't have a chance to get into all of them in the kind of depth we might like tonight, but can you give us a quick overview of those 5 traditions?
So the first is the importance of North America. And in some ways, this is obvious, but it's interesting. If you check most foreign policy websites, there are discussions about Europe and Asia Pacific or Indo-Pacific, often the Middle East, sometimes Latin America and Africa. It'd be interesting to do this for Pitt's School of International Affairs, but there's almost never anything done on North America. Well, obviously, North America was critical in the 19th century. I make the case it was true in the 20th century as well. We almost went to war with Mexico again in 1916 and 17. The Cuban Missile Crisis, the big nuclear showdown of the Cold War, was off Cuba and the Caribbean. And NAFTA, which was much more than a trade agreement, was an embrace of Mexico moving towards modernization and democracy. I came across a quote that Ronald Reagan used in 1979 as he launched his presidential campaign. And it was a wonderful comment. He said, the United States would be better off if Mexico and Canada were stronger, not weaker. And it's time that we stop thinking about our nearest neighbors as foreigners. So if you consider some of the debate that we've had over the recent years, that's a little different attitude towards North America. And of course, in another way, if you think about the interests that many Americans talk about today when asked about international relations, they may be immigration issues, they may be economic integration issues, they may be issues of organized crime and narcotics, they may be environmental topics. And of course, all those are deeply involved in the North American continent. And one other point that I've spent a lot of time working on in my career, as well as noting the historical point, is that I think it's important to look upon North America, not just among the 3 countries, but to see this as a continental base for United States external relations in other parts of the world. So if you think about the aspiration of 3 democracies, 500 million people, energy self-sufficiency and ability to export, better demographics than the rest of the world if we see people as human resources to develop, the economic integration of the region, it gives you a slightly different perspective of 1.3 billion Chinese or 1.4 billion Indians. So the starting point needs to be North America. Then the second one is trade, transnationalism, and technology. And here what I want to emphasize is that from 1776 on, the United States saw trade as more than a matter of economic efficiency. So people will, of course, recall Jefferson and the Declaration of Independence. John Adams served on that committee, but he chaired his own committee, which was to come up with the model treaty of the United States, Treaty of 1776. And it's basically a trade agreement. And if one thinks about the context in this era, the world was ruled by empires and mercantilism. So the American notion was to use trade to pry open the role for private parties, which of course is part of the American experience. Scholars will call them transnational actors. Other people will call them missionaries or sort of engineers or civil society groups. It's a key part of America and the world. And then obviously there's the role of technology development, which I try to draw out separately in the book. Then a third one is an interesting turn, which is the role of alliances in American policy. So some of you that studied history will recall Washington had this caution about permanent alliances, and then Jefferson cautioned against entangling alliances. So in some ways, if you look at America's international relations for the first 150 years, it was how do you engage in the world without alliances? Because alliances were associated with the old European system of militarism and balance of power. And whether it was international law traditions, economics, balance of power of different types, you can see the United States experimenting with other forms of relations. But then from 1947 to 49, not planned, quite actually by accident, the United States starts to develop the alliance system supported by an economic system that we then relied on for the next 70 years. Of course, it had to change after the end of the Cold War. And one of the issues of our policy today will be, whether the alliance system, what are the core elements, and is it important for the United States in the future? Then the fourth one is the importance of congressional and public support. And this is another one that often gets skipped in foreign policy courses. Foreign policy experts will often focus abroad, but not so much on home. Kennan, who was, of course, a great thinker, you could see why Atchison never wanted to let him go up to Congress, because his attitudes were scathing about the legislative branch. I use Senator Vandenberg, a Republican of Michigan, who worked closely with Truman in that 47-49 period to sort of put an example of this. But you can think of more recent examples, whether it be a John McCain or Senator Nunn or Lugar. And one of the questions will be, who will step up to these roles today? And the fifth and final tradition is what I call America's purpose. And I call it purpose as opposed to exceptionalism, because many countries feel they're exceptional, but there's no doubt that from the American perspective, there was always something larger at stake here. And the best anecdote I can give you on this is that for those of you that still carry wallets or cash, someday take out a dollar bill and look at the back. And you may never have given it much close attention, but you'll see the Great Seal of the United States. And the reverse of that seal, you'll see this unfinished pyramid. And note, it's unfinished. And it's on the top is the Eye of Providence, and below it is the term Novus Ordo Seclorum, New Order of the Ages. So from the very start of the United States, people were thinking in rather grand terms about shaping not only their country, but its effect internationally. And that's also an issue that sort of continues to be with us today. And you can see the Biden administration as it tries to sort of understand what are the issues directly related to interests, what are the values, and sort of what are the aspirations for freedom that have always been sort of part of America's purpose.
Maybe we could take a minute and combine two of these traditions, going back to the importance of North America and the importance of congressional and public opinion. The vision that you outlined of a 500 million person group of closely related democracies is certainly an appealing one. But if you look at public attitudes relating to NAFTA, and if you think about the Mexico bashing that has been so prominent over the course of the last few years, what do you think it would take, or how long do you think it would take to change some of those attitudes and begin moving in the direction of that quote you offered from President Reagan?
Well, you know, it's interesting. When President Trump wanted to get rid of NAFTA, and frankly, the current Mexican president, Lopez Obrador, wasn't very keen on it either, they actually found that they couldn't. What had happened over 30 years was that you'd built the ties that not only economic, but personally and others. So they modified it. In my view, they did some things that are less constructive, but they also added some other pieces. So I think there's a deeper recognition, while there's sensitivity of issues. So, you know, the start, of course, are the questions about border and immigration and rule of law. And my own sense is that, you know, to really deal with this over the time, the administration is going to have to deal with the basic conditions in Central America and Mexico that lead people to come. And when I was at the World Bank, I was focused, one of the areas of development that I paid some special attention to are the challenges of what we would call fragile or post-conflict states, because one recognized that it wasn't just a question of economic development, but there were security aspects, there were governance aspects, and each of the fields often worked in their own silos. So it was a question of how you would integrate those together. The successor agreement to NAFTA, the USMCA, has some interesting provisions worth watching. It has some very extensive extraterritorial laws about Mexican labor conditions, which would allow bringing actions against individual plants. And this could be used one of two ways. One is it could be used to strengthen the labor unions in Mexico, which would be a plus, just as frankly, the NAFTA helped build some very strong economic institutions with the central bank and the Ministry of Finance and some of the businesses. Or it could be used as a protectionist device and basically as an excuse to try to block Mexican exports. So that's an interesting example of the devil's in the details. And then we've got the very big challenge of legal versus illegal immigration. And my own sense is, while I'm somebody who tends to favor open immigration, when you have a sense of loss of control of the border, I think it is inevitably going to play into politics, whether it's here or whether you saw this in the case of the European Union. So I think one has to recognize this importance of border security. It's my view that a wall would never be that effective, but there's often aspects at the border as well as sort of beyond the border. And I think today, one of the things the administration is encountering is the legal context for this is particularly difficult. It's something that perhaps some of the people at Pitt's Law School might have some experience with. There's some obvious steps. For example, there's broad support about trying to have a path for the dreamers, the children that came as immigrants to the United States and to become full citizens as long as they have obeyed the law and have taken various steps to contribute to the society. But you can also see that the asylum laws that really came out of the Cold War, it's a question of whether they fit the type of problems that we're dealing with at the border. So you have the challenge of how do you treat people humanely? Are you creating incentives for people to come? And this goes right back to the issue of conditions in Central America. And again, what I would like to do with the point on North America is to reach a point where we tend to see the people of North America as a common workforce. And this is included with Canada too. It's a lot of limitations and restrictions on people's ability to work elsewhere. That doesn't mean they become citizens, but the question is, can we invest in the human capital in North America? Because when you see this in the bigger picture, in part, there are activities that now go on in China or Southeast Asia that could go on in Mexico. And if they go on in Mexico, frankly, you're going to improve the incomes in Mexico, and about 80% of their exports or imports are from the United States. So you end up buying more from the United States. So it's the notion that I think over the long term, the United States has to be better if we've got a successful democracy and a growing economy in Mexico. And I think we're now seeing the extent of that also raising with some of the questions in Central America.
You just mentioned a loss of control as a concern. That, of course, resurfaces when you're talking about alliances. You labeled your chapter about President George H.W. Bush, the alliance leader, and you were a part of his administration, and you make the point that he used international groups and organizations to extend American power, not to cede it. And yet there are those who almost automatically react poorly to the notion of America being put in a position where they lose some control. What do you see in terms of the role of alliances moving forward? And what do you think it will take for the United States not only to become a trusted partner again, but actually a leader?
So let me pick up on this by extending what we discussed a little bit with North America. When I was involved with the creation of NAFTA in the Bush 41 administration, Dick Thornberg also served, one of the points that was very apparent to us was that for reasons of history, all three countries, Canada, the United States, and Mexico, were very sensitive to their sovereignty and independence. We'd taken away about a third of Mexican territory. Canada always had this huge neighbor to the south. And so we had a challenge of coming up with a model of integration while respecting independence and sovereignty. And I draw attention to that because the concept behind the European Union, where Europeans talk about shared sovereignty, is a very different concept. And it's important to recognize how you can come up with cooperative measures while still respecting the independence and sovereignty of each country involved. Now, in the case of Bush 41 as an alliance leader, it starts out recognizing that his concept with Secretary Baker, who I worked for 8 years, was the United States isn't alone in the world. It's not a unipolar player. We're not a hegemon where we can dictate everything. In a sense, the United States is most effective when it's the nucleus of a network. We can get others to contribute, whether militarily, economically, politically, adding legitimacy. And part of the challenge for alliance leaders, it goes back to this experience with Franklin. You have to have your idea on the core objective. So for example, in German unification, it was to unify a democratic Germany within NATO and the European structures. With the coalition in the Gulf War, it was to put together a both political and a military and an economic support for making sure that the aggression of Saddam Hussein didn't succeed, but not going on to Baghdad. And if you have an idea on your core issues, then if you listen to your partners and treat them respectfully, you can often compromise on secondary questions that bring people along while the United States achieves its major purpose. And Bush and Baker were in some ways unique in being able to do this. People have referred in some ways to a relationship between an older and a younger brother. And the level of trust and communication was extraordinary. People recall Bush properly as a man who was prudent, a gentleman, but he was also fiercely competitive. And you can't understand George Bush unless you understand this is a guy that competed at everything from sort of full-pace golf to tennis to whatever the game was on, and including his competition with Gorbachev. And Baker was the person who was on point for him. Baker was the initiator. Baker was a very accomplished negotiator, an advocate, lawyer by training. And the key distinction for Baker was he was always focused on results. What could you get done? Not what you say, but sort of what you accomplished. He was quite comfortable with US power, and I think that's important for our leaders, without having a sense of abusing it or overusing it. And he obviously had strong relations with the Congress, which are very important in our political system. It was a way of using American power, but with restraint. And I've always found that to be the best combination, because there's almost always a sense that there's something else in reserve. And one of the people would refer to Baker often as kind of the iron fist in the velvet glove. He dealt diplomatically, he dealt as a gentleman, but there was a strong sense when we'd be meeting people that people wanted to be his friend, and they certainly didn't want to be his enemy. And what I do in that chapter is I talk about the early 1989 period, where in a sense, some historians will have a debate, when does the Cold War end? And it was Baker and Bush's view, as well as mine, that until you really overcome what had been the origin of the Cold War, the division of Germany and the division of Europe, to achieve what we called a Europe whole and free, you really hadn't, even though you had a better relationship with Gorbachev, you hadn't achieved your aim. And the key part that I talk about in that chapter is, while many historians focus on the relationship with Gorbachev and Russia, our first priority was Germany, our alliance partner, because there was a challenge after the negotiation of the intermediate range missiles, eliminating them in Europe, that the only ones left were the short range missiles. And as the Germans said, the shorter the missiles, the deader the Germans. So we had to focus earlier in '89, came up with a very bold conventional forces proposal that has pretty much been overlooked by historians as a way of rebuilding our alliance partnership before engaging with Gorbachev. So what I try to do in that chapter, as well as others, is sort of explain the nature of American leadership, working cooperatively with others, getting others to be of support, but always keeping your eye on your primary objective.
With respect to trading, transnational and technological partnerships, you devote an entire chapter or a good bit of a chapter to someone who is less well known, Vannevar Bush. You title his chapter "The Inventor of the Future." And in 1944, he appeared on the cover of Time magazine as the general of physics. He played a critical role in the priority that has been assigned to science in modern America, and in the growth of research universities like the University of Pittsburgh. Could you talk a little bit about his contributions?
Yeah, I'm glad you focused on him. It's a wonderful connection, particularly I hope with a Pitt audience and with the focus on engineering and science and technology at the school. So to give people a little bit further background, Vannevar Bush was a polymath engineer. He was an inventor. He actually was quite successful with a number of inventions. He had been a professor and vice president of MIT, but he became head of the Carnegie Science Institution in Washington. And while he was a man that was comfortable with science and engineering, he was also an applied person. He had workshops. He was seen, one of his colleagues described him as one of the best design people. We made things with his own hands. And the reason I include him in the book is that he is the godfather of an American policy that leverages perpetual science and technology change for foreign policy as well as our domestic. So a number of the chapters focus on geopolitics, or I include probably more on economics, given my background than some might. But I wanted to include something that focused on science and technology, because I believe it was very important in the Cold War, and I think it's going to be very important going forward. So when Bush uses his relationship with one of his board members, who was an uncle of FDR, and with some of the leading scientists, to create a new organization during World War II that tries to fuse together technology and warfare. And in the early days, other than the Army Air Corps, the technologists were often seen by the traditional soldiers and sailors as just sort of secondary players. And what Bush very much believed was that the technology and superiority in technology was going to be key to success in this war. So there were issues like the proximity fuse that they came up with, or radar developments, huge steps, as many people know, in the fields of medicine. An interesting one was, people who studied World War II know that the U-boats were really devastating the U.S. convoys in the 1942 era. And he came up with some ideas that basically drew on the field of operations research to combine information and intelligence sources with overflights and new types of offensive actions against the U-boats that basically by May of 1943 had devastated the U-boats. And Danitz, who's the naval commander of the U-boats in Germany, basically says, we weren't outfought, but we lost on terms of science and engineer. And of course, Vannevar Bush was the principal liaison for FDR with the whole atomic bomb project. But then he manages, and this is partly what I try to do in the book, is give people a sense of how this really works. He convinces some of the people around FDR to send him a letter in 1944 that asks about what's the future of American science policy. And the whole letter is still about 2 pages. And it leads to a report that Vannevar Bush puts together, a very large report, but he writes the key sort of covering aspect. It's called Science, the Endless Frontier. And so this is a nice thing in that foreign policy often thinks about frontiers and geography, but here it's science's notion of the endless frontier. And what he basically comes up with is what at Stanford is described as the triple helix system. And what this involves would be government supporting basic research, very involved with America's universities, but then also connecting with the private sector. And an important part of Bush's thinking was one of America's strengths was independent thinkers, mavericks, innovators. And he wanted to figure out a way for people to continue to be independent thinkers, but also be part of the security system. And I think as people will reflect on the history of the Cold War, you could see that the Soviet system, which was much more of a command economy and controlled, hardly can't keep up by the 1980s with technology. It'd be an interesting issue today. The Chinese approach is superior to the Soviet approach, but it also has a lot of centralized control elements. How will it compete? But one other aspect that I wanted to introduce in this chapter was that I think there's another issue about how we combine science with public policy. So in 1992, I was the lead official for the only climate change framework treaty that's ever been ratified by the Senate. And it's the framework treaty that actually is the basis for the Paris Accords and the Conference of the Parties that you'll hear later this year in Glasgow, because it's the basic rules and framework for the national action plans people devise for climate. And similarly, if you think about issues of biological security coming off the pandemic, how do you combine science and public policy in a foreign policy context? And again, just to give you another practical example, in that 92 agreement, I had to fight very hard to get the notion that we would look at sinks for carbon as well as the sources of production, and the notion of trading systems, which particularly in the Pittsburgh area, people may recall was also part of the Clean Air Act and dealing with some of the issues of acid rain. And so those fundamentals were important in developing the framework for the future. But the last part about Vannevar Bush, this is why history is so wonderful, you can't make this up, is that in 1945, he not only was on the scene for the atomic bomb test, and he comes up with his Endless Frontier report, but he writes an article for the Atlantic where he imagines something called the Memex machine. And what he's basically doing is he's envisioning the notion of a desktop computer 40 years before it's invented. And remember, in 1945, we were just starting to get used to big computers, much less a desktop computer. But he's describing it will have links with systems, it'll give access to information. And it turns out a reprint of this article is read by a young Navy radar technician off in Leyte in the Philippines in a Red Cross library on stilts. And it leads him to go back and commit himself to get computer science degrees and basically become one of the founders of the personal computer. Another one of Bush's graduate students, Fred Terman, becomes the provost of Stanford and found something called Silicon Valley. So it gives you a wonderful sense of the stream of history, which I think was important to our foreign policy as well as science and technology.
What amazing impact. I would like to devote some time to questions that were submitted by the registrants. Not surprisingly, the rise of China as an economic and military power was mentioned more often than any other topic. What impact is the rise of China likely to have on the world order? And how can the U.S. best respond?
Yeah, this is obviously going to be one of the big topics for the United States today and well into the future. And I guess I would approach it in some ways based on some of the points that I just mentioned, is that I think the starting point of dealing with China depends on what we do at home, not only in terms of science and technology, but our strength as a society. I would extend, obviously, this even to a broader sort of North American context. And then the next step is to think about what we've discussed, Mark, with allies and partners. Who does China have as allies instead of North Korea? If we're effective, we've got a wide range of partners that won't agree with everything, but I think will share our overall concerns, whether they be security or economic. And then I think one of the other issues we see in the debate now is that sometimes we have an odd reaction. We see authoritarian systems and we perceive their strengths without recognizing their weaknesses. And so sometimes we try to follow them and close ourselves off. I think this is a huge mistake. I mean, I think the United States' fundamental strength is its openness to ideas, to goods, to capital, to people, to ideas. We will never compete effectively with China by trying to close ourselves off. Trust me, they can control things much more effectively than we can. And it would be a mistake for us to try to do so. I think one of the problems that I saw in the Trump approach, he spent his first 3 years basically trying to do a managed trade agreement of purchases, which was only about 50% successful anyway. And the focus wasn't on the rules of the system. It was just basically sort of a managed trade. And then after COVID hit, the politics switched more to sort of the notion of confrontation and condemnation. That's not the same as competition. How you're going to be able to compete most effectively. And as I've alluded to, for example, Europe and Asia are not going to believe you can contain China or totally decouple from China. It's impossible to do. So how do you try to put together a combination of deterrence on security issues, competition, and in some areas, cooperation? How are you going to deal with climate if you don't have China part, or frankly, biological security, or a lot of economics issues? I think one of the dangerous aspects, but I'll freely acknowledge I'm in the minority on this, is there's a new conventional wisdom that's crept in that cooperation with China failed. And that's just flat wrong. If you look at the cooperation on a lot of arms proliferation issues, on a lot of economics issues, China had the biggest stimulus in the global financial crisis. They quit manipulating their currency. It was the fastest growing export market for the United States for 15 years. And frankly, on UN Security Council resolutions, we talk about the first Gulf War, where we managed to get UN Security Council and a big coalition. Well, that was right after Tiananmen Square, and it wasn't so easy. We just managed to get the Chinese to abstain in the process. And so it isn't saying that everything is great with China, and I think Xi Jinping has definitely moved it in a more troublesome direction. But the question would be, going back to what I said about the Baker experience. So what do you want to get done? What are the results? Just sort of casting aspersions is not necessarily going to be successful. And I do believe that there are areas where we can find some mutual interest, not only on climate and biological security, but even take some of the economics issues. As China moves up the value-added curve, it's actually paid more attention to intellectual property rights. And it's created a series of intellectual property rights courts that fine for foreigners about 85 to 90% of the time, but the penalties aren't high enough. So frankly, we should be negotiating for higher penalties. Or people have read about the forced technology transfers, which is clearly prohibited by their accession to the WTO, but it was hard to get companies to provide the evidence because they were afraid of retaliation. So frankly, I think a lot of these problems stem from the joint venture requirements that China has. It makes the temptation to steal the technology. So I'd push to get rid of a lot of the joint venture requirements. And then this doesn't mean by any means the United States gives up its stand on its values. The question is, how does one do it? Reagan had a wonderful quality, even dealing with the Soviet Union, where he was frankly always trying to convert them. He wasn't trying to insult them. He was talking about the aspirations of freedom. And if we just sort of pummel the Chinese and say, well, you've done this wrong and that wrong, what do we expect to do? Do we think we're going to overthrow the regime? Do we expect a land war in Asia? Those haven't worked out so well. And I'll give you a very practical example. In Hong Kong, where the Chinese have clearly cracked down and violated their set of obligations, rather than just trying to sanction people, I would do what the British did, which is to create opportunities for people from Hong Kong to come to the United States. What a better way to show the difference between the two societies. Now, not all would. In fact, maybe very few would. But it's a way of really showing the difference between a free society and an authoritarian system. So I think in the near term, Mark, the Biden administration has to deal with the political fervor on China. I think they'd like to get some off ramps. They'd like to figure out some ways to sort of manage the domestic politics by doing some of the things that I've mentioned. But it's going to be a tense period. And there are some issues like Taiwan that if people are not careful about could really flare up. And so it goes back, I think what you'll see the administration doing is they're obviously focusing first on the home front. You know, when my boss Baker worked for Reagan in '81, he said, "Mr. President, you have three priorities: economic recovery, and economic recovery." Well, for Biden, it's pandemic and economic recovery. And then I think what you'll see is some of the issues, whether it be climate or immigration, they'll connect internationally and with their allies and partners. But for the long term, the two big challenges of our foreign policy will be the future of free societies and dealing with China.
You have said that one of the challenges of diplomacy is recognizing liars. Today, it seems all too often that we're surrounded by liars. How do you view the problem of disinformation, and what can we do about that domestically and internationally?
I think, I mean, and you're a lawyer, Mark, so you'll understand my legal distinctions here. There's first a level of countries that try to manipulate our elections. And frankly, I would have, in the 2016 election, I didn't think Obama responded firmly enough, and Trump clearly didn't care to do so. And I think that's a big mistake, because I think our elections go to the heart of our security. They go to our Constitution. So whether through retaliatory policies, whether cyber or even non-cyber, I would make it quite clear that this is hands off and not to be played with, or that we'll make sure that there are costs that they have to incur. As for the broader issue of disinformation, as you know, in a free society, the question is who decides what's disinformation or not. And so here, I tend to lean towards encouraging the broader debate rather than having either the government or companies decide kind of what or is not debated. I should disclose, I'm on the Twitter board. And so we face the issue of what do you do with some of the, whether it was election issues or health issues or civic integrity issues. And the company tended to move towards a notion of labeling. And again, things don't have to be, on or off on this. I do think labeling may be kind of a useful device. And companies obviously invent rules, and they can have the participants follow those rules or suspend them accordingly. I think if they do, what you'll start to see is more decentralization in the system. People will go to sort of other types of networks. I do think also, if they're foreign source information from governments, that may be is I think an appropriate area for labeling. But this is where it's always tricky. It goes back to this point about with authoritarian societies, do you want to chase them down the rabbit hole? When China took action against Western reporters, I'm not sure the best thing was for the United States to act against Chinese reporters. If they're spies and you need to throw them out for espionage, fine, do that. But when we shut down consulates, or then basically the Chinese were delighted to retaliate against Western press. And frankly, we have less information in this society. And my own belief is that, while China has strengths, it's also not 10 feet tall. And there's debates that'll go on within China. And insofar as we continue to push the beliefs that we believe are important and that we stand for them, we emphasize at home, that's the best way to stand for an open society, not by trying to close things down.
Let me ask a question on behalf of our students. How did your college and graduate school experiences shape your career? And is there any advice that you would give to current students?
So they should read the book. I hope they buy it, but otherwise they should read the book. But there's actually a serious point on that. I always loved history, and I found history, I suppose in academic terms, it gives you a multidisciplinary foundation. It's just like regional studies. We've kind of lost the touch of regional studies. But so in my career, I combined history with economics, and then I learned there was something called finance on top of economics, and sort of law and organizational behavior, by example, with Thornberg, looking at the organization of the criminal division. So I tended to look upon history, not so much for analogies, which can be misleading, but to think about questions. And particularly for students interested in international affairs, you know, people overseas find that Americans often don't know much about the rest of the world. And boy, you can score huge points by simply knowing enough to ask questions. And I think, again, I drew upon history to think about questions. I suppose professionally, the one other piece of advice I'd give them, and this may seem odd to younger people, but I think there's some truth to it, is pick your boss. And it might seem odd because you probably think your boss picks you, and that's of course true. But also what I'm saying here is think about people you can learn from. It doesn't mean that you admire everything that they do. But I was fortunate. I mentioned people like Baker, but I clerked for Judge Pat Wald on the U.S. Court of Appeals. I worked for Joe Califano, who had been working with her for LBJ. And from each of them, I learned, Phil Hyman, I mentioned with the criminal division. I tried to observe and learn. And I suppose one of the other qualities was, if you're working for somebody like that, try to think about what you can do to help them perform better. So as opposed to think what you want, think about what they need. And this was quite accidental, but it turned out to be useful, is that the more you start to think like, well, if I'm the decision maker, what would I need to know? Or how would I need to think about implementation or bringing people together? There's more likely you'll become the decision maker if you think in those terms. So that would be my suggestion. And the one other point, which I hope for your Pitt community is the case. Because of the book, I've talked to a number of different universities, and sometimes with some younger people now, there's sort of a frustration and cynicism that sort of creeps in. And I just have to say, you know, this goes back a little bit to your and my sort of generation experience, when I think, yes, there's problems, but trust me, there were problems in the 60s and 70s and 80s too. And so the opportunities out there. And frankly, you know, if you're an American university or an American, there's huge potential to make a difference, whether it's in the public sector, nonprofit sector, private enterprise. And so I hope that people see some of this as an idea, as I mentioned in the book, about how to do better, how to kind of learn from the experience, because the ability to contribute is huge.
Well, thank you, Bob, not just for being here tonight, though we're grateful for that, but for all of the contributions you have made over the course of such an extraordinary career. And of course, thank you for writing the book. It is a book that has attracted such adjectives as groundbreaking, outstanding, insightful, accessible, engaging, and just plain wonderful. I sent a copy to a friend, and I found over the course of a couple of weeks, we were calling each other to compare notes on different sections. And when he finished it last week, he sent me a one-word review. Brilliant. So you ought to feel good about that work. And of course, we just had the chance to really scratch the surface tonight. So thank you very much. I also do want to thank the members of the audience and remind you that next week on the evening of Thursday, April 15th, not tax day this year, we will be resuming our Preserving Democracy series. Our topic will be bridging the gap between rural and urban America. And our special guest will be Jen Giovanetti, the president of the Claude Worthington Benedum Foundation. The Benedum Foundation is a place-based funder dedicated to rural communities. That also has been the focus of the dedication of Jen's life. It ought to be a very interesting evening. So thanks to you all. Good night. Hope to see you next week. And thanks in particular to you, Bob. It's been great to have this reunion.
Well, Mark, let me just again thank you for the generous invitation and for the Pitt community that listened to us. But I also want to give a special thanks. Your contributions to the university and the community you live are a model in and of themselves. So best to you.
Thanks very much. And we'll get you and Sherry back so she can actually see the products of the work of her father's early professional life.
Look forward to it.
Okay, thanks very much.